Welcome back. Today we are going to wrap up the discussion on the American Renaissance and move on to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, slave narratives, and domestic novels. On we go.
Huh? Go? Where?
For the American Renaissance, you tell me, why these dates?
The first was Emerson's speech, wasn't it? The American scholar, the cultural independence thingy.
Bingo. Nicely described, I think. The other?
Your birthday?
Nice try. No. I'll try to forget that.
The end of the Civil War, sir.
Bingo. One of the few really important dates in American history. Now, if the cultural independence thingy marked the change into a new era, what might be the characteristics of this new era?
They were no longer copying Europe, they wrote their own material and used their own themes.
A slam dunk. This marks a change, the development of a truly different American style of literature. And it is marked by the publication of 5 works of classic American literature in a 5-year period. The Scarlet Letter in 1850, Moby Dick in 1851, Walden in 1854, and Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman in 1855. The themes in all these? Not man's position in a class-based society like in Europe, but the individual outside of society, the individual's relationship to society. This is putting it very simplistically, of course, but you'll note that those works all deal with individuals who develop outside of traditional social institutions. You'll see that as well when we come to Leaves of Grass. The man who came up with this term, American Renaissance, noted that it was a flowering of truly original thought in the New World. He focused on the democratic tendencies of the main writers.
Hey, that's only 4 books. You said 5.
Ah, a math major among us. Yes, the 5th book in this short 5-year period was the best-selling work of fiction in the U.S. in the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Hawthorne's novel made him famous at the time and sold 2,500 copies in the first 10 days and around 13,000 copies in his lifetime. Good sales in the U.S. then were around 10 to 20,000. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in its first year. Only the Bible sold better. It was eventually published in 22 languages and sold some 3 million copies in the 19th century. Queen Victoria read it. The German poet Heinrich Heine was moved by it. And this anti-slavery novel galvanized public opinion in the U.S. When Abraham Lincoln met Stowe during the Civil War, he supposedly exclaimed, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Very briefly, the book details the fate of 2 black slaves, Eliza, a mulatta house servant, and Uncle Tom, a black field hand. Both start on the same farm in Kentucky near the Ohio River. The first flees north to Canada to freedom, and Uncle Tom is sold south, encountering worse and worse owners until he's beaten to death by his last owner for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. Stowe paints him as a Christ-like figure who suffers a martyr's death. Slaveholders in the South had used the Bible as a justification for slavery. The Old Testament does have a number of figures who were slave owners, and Paul's letters specifically call on slaves to obey their masters. But Stowe used Uncle Tom to turn this whole idea on its head. Uncle Tom is as good a Christian as there ever was. In fact, almost too good to be true. 19th century readers loved the sentimentality in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where tears flowed freely. Modern readers are not so fond of long death scenes. A little girl dies of tuberculosis over 3 long chapters and converts everyone around her to Christianity in the process. But there is another reason why Uncle Tom has not been liked in the 20th and 21st centuries, and that is the portrayal of Uncle Tom himself, which many consider to be racist. Why, for example, does Tom accept his second-class position so easily? Having Tom also accept a white child as superior to himself is something many people today can't stomach. It's a traditional portrayal that survived for years, that blacks play a second-class role to whites. By the 1960s, calling a black man an Uncle Tom was an insult. It meant he was an apologist for his white boss. In the same vein, a Jemima was a woman who always obeyed the white man and did his bidding. The character of Aunt Chloe fits this description. But for her sources for Uncle Tom, Stowe drew not only upon common white prejudices, but also used what was becoming a very popular genre by the 1850s, the slave narrative. Slave narratives had been around since the 18th century, but they became very popular starting in the 1830s, as the debate about slavery started becoming an increasingly divisive issue in the U.S. In the North, abolitionists, people radically opposed to slavery, started holding rallies to campaign against slavery. One of their most effective weapons were the stories told by former slaves, who they at times recruited to talk during these rallies. These escaped slaves sometimes were given help to write their stories, so-called ghostwriters.
Ghosts. Cool.
And sometimes they wrote their autobiographies themselves. But these brought other problems, namely whether the white audiences would believe them or not. After a slave rebellion in 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, it was generally illegal to teach slaves to read and write. Plus, many whites held the racist belief that blacks weren't smart enough to learn much in the first place. So because they were used as propaganda, because they had to establish credibility with white readers, and because they were so popular, the narrative started to develop common features. They included stories of slaves learning to read and write, stories of them realizing their status as a slave, usually at the age of 6 or so, stories of other slaves being beaten or whipped even if the slave writer himself was never beaten. Usually the slave was a Christian, almost always a male, and almost never did their story continue beyond their escape and arrival in the North.
And just why might that be?
They were Christians so as to establish a common bond with the reader. Male, because it was pretty difficult for female slaves to escape given the long journey and the children they had. And they stopped at freedom because abolitionists weren't keen on showing the racism in the North. They also seldom told exactly how they escaped, so as not to give away the methods and secrets of the Underground Railway. Although one slave, Henry Box Brown, did become famous for the story of how he was mailed to the North in a big box. The narrative started getting somewhat sensationalist in the time just before the war. But by far the most famous slave narrative is that of Frederick Douglass. His first autobiography in 1845 showed him to be an eloquent and energetic man. He published 2 more versions later, the last after he continued as a civil rights activist after the Civil War. His book shows us how he learned to read and write by playing with white boys when he was young. It shows us the pain of being a slave.
I know exactly what he means about thinking.
And his physical battle with a white slave breaker as a 16-year-old set the standard for later black male defiance of slavery and racism. A black man would not only have to be smarter to out-trick whites, but also physically resist. There is a different path of defiance for women, but we'll read about that in the seminar. But if the most popular book in the Renaissance was a fictional slave narrative, the most popular genre of the era were domestic novels, books written by and for women. If Hawthorne was happy for having a bestseller in the Scarlet Letter, he was also rather envious and a bit bitter that he was routinely outsold by female authors. The reason for their popularity was clear. There was a large, fast-growing middle-class audience in the U.S., universal schooling was increasing literacy, and the publishing industry was booming. These authors all told strikingly similar stories. It was a young girl's initiation into life. The girl, often an orphan, went through bitter experiences, but eventually learned the virtues of domestic life, and the ending was often marriage.
Don't sound like no high literature to me. Any whales in there?
Any priests?
Priests are Catholic, ministers are Protestant, and the U.S. was largely Protestant at that time. So, no whales, very few ministers, especially in that way, and in fact, very few men at all. And this is what makes the novel so interesting. It shows females not needing men to be strong. Again, like de Tocqueville said, 19th century U.S. society gave men and women separate roles and separate spheres. So it may be popular but not high literature, But popular literature still reveals a culture's beliefs about social roles and unconscious desires in people at that time. Women submitted to men in society, but still created spaces for themselves. And speaking of popular literature, next time we turn from girls' literature to boys' literature with Huckleberry Finn. One of the questions there is whether or why a story about a 13-year-old is high literature at all. But we'll talk about that next time.